All right, everyone. Welcome back to Tuesday night for Book Talk. And tonight I am so excited to be able to introduce you to my friend Karen Witemeyer, which I love her books. I've got a stack of them over here that I'm sure we'll talk about in the next few minutes. But today is the release day for her brand new book, The Heart's Charge. And it is fantastic if you like cowboys and humor. And then what I love that you're doing with this series is there's some great mystery with it as well. So we'll be talking about that and a lot of other things tonight. But Karen, do you want to take a moment and introduce yourself?
Thanks, Cara. I really appreciate you having me tonight. This is a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for joining.
Yeah. So my name is Karen Witemeyer, and I write historical romance for the inspirational market. Most of my books are set in Texas around the 1880s, 1890s era. I do love a hunky Cowboys, so they make very prominent appearances in my stories. This latest series is called the Horseman series. There are a group of 4 ex-cavalry officers who, after the tragedies at Wounded Knee, decide to leave the military and become vigilantes for justice. Those of you who watched TV back in the 80s might recognize the themes from the A-Team. This is kind of my A-Team meets the Magnificent Seven crossover. So you've got four tough guys who are out there trying to make a difference for good. And the first book in the series, At Love's Command, features Matthew Hanger, who's the captain and the leader of the Horsemen. And this book, The Heart's Charge, has 2 heroes in it, Mark Wallace and Jonah Brooks, who are both members of the Horsemen as well. And of course, they meet their ladies in this book as they're trying to rescue some missing children. So that's where we are with the Horsemen.
And what I love about this book is you've got 2 romances going on, which that's not usually kind of what's happening in your books. You always have a really strong romance, and you do have those hunky cowboys like you were talking about, because they're set in Texas and usually kind of that 1870s to 80s range. I think this is a little earlier, but I love that you brought these kids into it. So how did you decide on that as kind of the theme and the mystery that was happening?
So you mentioned the 2 different love stories that are going on at the same time. Because there's 4 horsemen in this group and there's only 3 books in the series, I really wanted to make sure that all 4 horsemen got a full romance. So I wanted all their POVs. And so when I proposed this book, I really wanted to have 4 full POVs. So 2 heroes, 2 heroines. So you could really get to enjoy their full and robust love story. And that was it was a challenge to make them both equal and not have one be dominant and another one be like a subplot. So I had to work to really make them both equal. But it was important to me that neither one of them be shortchanged. I wanted them to both have a full story. And then with the children, I've always, I'm a mom of 3. I have a soft spot in my heart for children. And I needed something to kind of help soften these tough guys. And so I had 2 women who were running a foundling home. And their mission was to take care of outcast children, those that didn't have a place to go anywhere else. So you have children who have mixed heritage, you have children with disabilities, you have children who have scarred faces and just other issues that would make them in that time period not welcome in other places. And so these women really felt called to minister to these children that are outcasts. And so they opened up this foundling home. Well, in addition to the children at the foundling home, there's also a group of rail car boys who they call them boxcar boys, I guess.
Yeah.
They're kind of like young hobos that are just, they don't want to be tied down. They don't have any parents. So they're just out doing their own thing. But they start going missing. And the horsemen decide they need to stay around to try to figure out where these boys are. Because no one, since they don't have parents, no one is really paying attention to them and looking for them.
Well, and I thought it was just so interesting because you have these young kids who are essentially orphaned. Or I'm assuming for the most part that they're orphaned because nobody's looking for them and they're just hopping on and off of these trains. And yet you've got some adults who are looking out for them. And then you have these other adults who may not be, but because they're orphans, if they disappear, nobody really knows. And so it was such an interesting concept. Did you come across that like in your research, or was that something that just kind of, as you were thinking about, okay, what do I do with these characters? How do I get these men to have a reason to stay where these lovely ladies are? How did you kind of come up with that as the hook? Because I've done a lot of research, but I've never run across that.
Yeah, I didn't find a whole lot in my research for that, but it was kind of one of those what if moments. So I need my heroes to stick around, need to figure out why they're sticking around. Yeah. I wanted missing children to play into it, but I needed to figure out a way that no one would already be looking, because if my child was missing, you better believe I'm going to make a huge stink and we're going to have a search party out. We are going to make sure we find these kids, right? And townspeople are decent people. They would be out looking for missing children, unless they're people, that are missing are those that nobody notices and nobody is in charge of. And so that kind of just, I kept going down that road of what if, and I know there was a lot of, in this time period, homelessness was still a very real thing back then. We didn't have government programs to take care of situations. And there were a lot of children that just were living on the streets and making do as best they could. And so this is a group of streetwise, toughened boys who just, traveled the train and basically thieve and find ways to support themselves along the way.
Yeah, and I thought that was so real, because then this is the time when you've got some of the orphan trains going through from the cities, because you've got, the cities are dirty, you've got illnesses running rampant, so you've got these kids who suddenly find themselves as orphans, and there's not necessarily a lot of support for that, so the kids are coming across on the trains. You've just got all of these tragic, really, we can look at today and go, man, this is not a great time to live, and I'm like, we have penicillin and we've got sanitation and we've got good food. We've got so much. Mm-hmm. And I felt like this book just kind of really highlighted that in some ways, because you're dealing with those who are forgotten and the least protected, both at the foundling home and then with these kids who are completely on their own. I think the oldest, who was kind of the ringleader, was like 12.
Right.
And I know at that point in time, people grew up much faster than they do today, but my daughter just turned 13. And so Linda was asking, is this a sad story? And I would say, oh, no, not at all. But it is reflective of what was going on at that time and kind of how dangerous it really was. So how do you infuse hope into a situation where you've got a woman who's essentially been abandoned by her family? You've got all these children, and it starts with a newborn up through these 12-year-old boxcar kids. How do you infuse hope into something that really could be a heavy downer type of situation?
Well, obviously for us that are Christians, the source of our hope comes from God. And it really helps that all of the main characters are very strong believers. The two ladies who run the foundling home, they are both very missions minded. They are here. They feel called by God to be here, to protect these children and to look out for these children, and to teach and nurture the children. Eliza is more of she wants to meet their practical needs. She wants to teach them what they need to know to survive, give them a good education. Catherine, on the other hand, is the nurturer. She wants to love them and make sure they are in a good emotional place. So you really have them surrounding these children and nurturing them and teaching them and giving them a sense of hope so that they don't feel like they are alone and nobody cares about them, nobody loves them. The little boy, Abner, who was at the family home, he came from a really rough background. His mother was a prostitute, and he was in an abusive situation. And when Catherine found him and actually showed him love, it was like the door to his life just opened, and he thought, wow, I've never experienced this. This is transformational. And that's kind of the message I want to share with the readers, is that you yourself might be needing that door open to feel God's love and to feel his acceptance, or you may be in a position where you can open that door for somebody else and show them that kind of love and acceptance and really make a huge difference in their lives.
That's so right. And Catherine was talking about, these kids are still out there. It's not a historical problem. It really still is present today. And I've got an adoption coming up next week. That's about the only part of law that I still actively practice because I teach full time. And I work with an agency to a large extent where they are doing that kind of thing. They're taking it, they're helping these newborns that for whatever reason can't stay with their parents and helping them get into these forever homes. And so it's very much still an issue today. And so, even raising our awareness to look around and go, okay, who are the kids who are constantly running around without adult supervision? Some of that's okay. That's good. That's part of being a kid. But some of they need other adults to step in and be that safe place and that place where they can feel secure and loved. And so I love that that's a possibility, that's an option in this kind of situation. So I've got a question for you, and then we'll get to some of your posse questions. But why Texas and why Cowboys? Because that is definitely what you do. And it doesn't matter which one, but you always find a hook. Like with Full Steam Ahead, it was this really cool scientific advancement, like the steam engine, and then Head in the Clouds. I mean, my gosh, such a neat book. They're all wonderful. Why this time period and why Cowboys?
Well, I grew up watching Westerns on TV, especially on Saturday. I think they had Saturday morning Westerns and they were all reruns. I was a child in the late 70s, early 80s. And that, was carryover from, I guess, the 50s and 60s when all those, Bonanza and the Big Valley and Wagon Train and all those were super popular. Well, I grew up watching all of those reruns. And I think that really kind of formed that love of the cowboy in me. Plus, I grew up reading Little House on the Prairie. I was, as most girls were at that age, I loved horses. It was just kind of, it just, I guess, was infused into me as I was growing up. I also was actually from California, is where I grew up, and I was from a small town. And I didn't own any horses, but we did live out in the country, and there were people down the road who had horses. And I didn't get to ride very often, but I had, an occasional chance to ride. But I would love to just walk down the road and, feed some grass to the horses and pet their necks and, that kind of thing. And so I had a love for that. It's something that when I thought, what would I like to write? That was the first thing that came to my mind. Yeah. Then, of course, it didn't hurt that I moved to Texas when I was in college. So I came as a freshman out to Abilene Christian University in Abilene, Texas. I still live in Abilene, Texas. I work for the university now. I just got sucked into the culture and never left. Helps that I married a Texan. So he's not really a cowboy. He's more of a computer nerd, but he's still a full-fledged Texan. So I count that. Yeah.
So one of the questions we have, or I guess comments, is people are like, we love the cowboy stories. We love those TV shows. But on Bonanza, were you Team Adam or Team Little Joe?
Oh, Adam all the way. Adam all the way. Yeah. Yeah.
I actually was looking it up over here because I'm like, okay, I remember watching Bonanza, but I should have remembered Little Joe, but I was like, I'm completely blanking on who those characters were. So, and Catherine is like, yep, I had horses in California in the city back in the 70s. Oh, that's so funny. And Stephanie's like, I love both your books. Thank you, Stephanie. So those shows, I could totally hear it. My 10-year-old and I just got done listening to all the Little House on the Prairie books, and it was so fun. But it really, in some ways, I feel like, okay, I can now go live on the frontier because she tells you how to do everything in those books. So one of the things that I find interesting is that you have written all of your books, at least that I'm aware of, and you're probably going to correct me right now, in this time and in this kind of location. So how do you keep coming up with new and fresh takes on Texas Cowboys?
Well, it helps that Texas is so big. So, it's a huge state. And so geographically, there's so many different areas. I've had books set in the piney forests. I've had books down by Galveston and on the river. Yeah. I've had books that are set more in the hill country. I've had books more in central western Texas. So there's a lot of different geography. And of course, in this time period, a lot of occupations and other things were revolving around that geography. And so, whether you had farms or ranches, or you were in town and you ran the livery, or you were a seamstress, or, whatever the situation was, there's a lot of food for thought, a lot of opportunities to explore in Texas, and there's always someplace new to find. I love getting out old maps and finding places that I had never heard of. When I was writing the first book in the series, At Love's Command, I got out an old.
Such a good one.
I got out an old railroad map and was looking to see where the railroad went, and I was trying to find a cute little town that I could set. It had to be a small enough town that they would accept a female doctor, because most places, wouldn't. So they had to be really desperate for a doctor. And I found this town. It was called Purgatory Springs. I'm like, that is the perfect name. And I look, it doesn't exist on any maps today. And it's because it was renamed, I think it was renamed Hugo later, like around the turn of the century. And even now, I think all that is really there is like a cemetery. I don't think there's even a town there anymore. But finding those little nuggets that just spark your imagination and get you going, that's just fun to me.
I love that. Well, yeah, and you would see a name like Purgatory Springs, you'd be like, okay, there is a story there, and if there isn't, I'm going to create one, because the name is just too fun. And there is this huge commentary going on in the comments about which show is the best cowboy show, and everything from Rifleman to Big Valley. And just it's fun to watch these conversations that are happening. And I don't know about you. Do you watch a lot of TV right now? Because that's one of the things that I gave up when I started writing. So for the most part, unless it's the Olympics or college football, I'm not going to watch a whole lot of TV. I watch movies and then, stream the Marvel shows. But other than that, there's not much that I watch.
I still watch some, and it's mainly because that's how my husband and I unwind at the end of the day. We'll TiVo stuff, and then we'll pull up a show and watch it. I end up watching a lot of crime shows, so like the Law and Order spinoffs, that's the stuff my husband likes as well. Yeah. And so maybe that's why I've had more mysteries that have kind of snuck into my books. So you never know where inspiration's going to strike.
It's so true. And NCIS is something that my dad watches like all the time. And so my kids, I've got my 20-year-old, I think, has gone through most of the series, like all 19 seasons. And then my 17-year-old, and now my 13-year-old and my husband are watching it almost every night. They watch one episode, because when you're streaming it, it's much shorter because you don't have all those commercials, just like with TiVo. Right. And so it's amazing how much time you can save when you're streaming something or TiVoing it. So, and I bet you watch enough of that, and you're going to be denozoing people, and you're going to have all kinds of mysteries just kind of slipping in, which as a reader, I love. I love when there's a romance. And then I love if it's historical and I'm learning something, like in Full Steam Ahead. That was so much fun. But then when there's a little bit of mystery or suspense, it's like that's the bow that just makes a book perfect for me, when it's kind of got all of that going on. But as a writer, that's a challenge. So are you a pantser or a plotter? Do you kind of know from the beginning what you're going to do? Or do you discover the story as you're writing it and rewriting it and rewriting it?
Right. I'm actually kind of, I would guess, in the middle of the road. So I need to write a synopsis at the beginning. So I know I know who the characters are. I know the main kind of big plot points, and I know how it's going to end. And part of that is because I need to submit that to my editor so they can give me approval to go ahead and start writing. So I have kind of big picture stuff figured out. I have setting pretty much figured out. And then I just sit down and start writing. So it's kind of like I have a very vague roadmap, so I know where my big stops are, and then I just kind of meander till I get to each one of those big stops, and then it just kind of comes together at the end. And I am kind of a strange writer. I write very slowly, but I write basically one draft, and then I turn it in. So I edit as I go, and I get, I send each of my chapters off to critique partners. They give me feedback as I'm writing. So it's a really slow process, but once I get to the end, I'm done. I turn it in. And of course, then there's always rewrites that come back from the department, but that's how I work.
Well, and that's the best part about working with a publisher is, and when you've got good beta readers, whether they're in a critique group or just people who've read your books and know what your kind of hallmarks are, then it just makes it fun because you can be very clean. Like I tend to be the same way. If I have a good idea of kind of the overarching kind of bones of the story, then it's usually pretty clean. I'll go through it once, but it's really just to make sure I haven't dropped a thread, I haven't changed the name of a character midstream, that kind of stuff. But then it's at the point where I'm like, okay, I know there's more that needs to be done, but I don't know what it is. So it's time to send it to the editor and let them work their magic. And that collaborative process can get started then.
Right.
So while we're talking about that, Catherine's like, I write the same way and I like to make research trips too. So
yes.
Do you do that a lot? You know, you're looking at maps. Did you go to Purgatory Springs / Hulu / whatever it's called out of town?
I did not go to Purgatory Springs, but I did get to go to Kingsland, which is the setting for the Heart's Charge. And in fact, it was wonderful. I like to use maps, and they have a lot of historical maps that are called Sanborn maps that are created basically for the fire department way back in the day. So they would know where the buildings were, what was in each building. So you could see this is a grocery, this is a drugstore, this is a livery, this is that kind of thing. They are fabulous, but they didn't have one for Kingsland. So I was like, I need to find out some way that I can get some historical data. So I reached out to the Chamber of Commerce, and they said, well, we have somebody who's kind of a local historian who might, he's written a book about Kingsland. He might be able to get you some information. So I reached out to him. He was very kind in getting me some old photographs of the rivers and the bridges and things like that.
That's cool.
And some of the information that he gave me ended up working its way into the book, because he talked about one of the bridges. Kingsland is pretty much surrounded by water. That's where two rivers come together, the Llano River and the Colorado River. And the Llano kind of wraps around Kingsland. And so it's almost completely surrounded. So on one side, the only way to get into town was over this bridge that they built for the railroad. It's a railroad bridge, right? It's not a passenger bridge or a pedestrian bridge. And so school kids would cross it, anybody would cross it. But there were times when, if you didn't time it correctly, in his information that he sent me, it talked about, people who would like climb down on the piers and hold on while the train went by because, they were stuck on the middle of the bridge when the train went by. And I was like, I have got to find a way to use that in my,
yes. And so you did.
Yes. And it was one of my favorite scenes out of the whole book. So I won't give anything away, but there is, and
it was such a tension filled. I was like, there has to be some kind of nugget behind this, or else your imagination is just crazy amazing. And it's probably both. So it's so fun to hear, because that's where research can be so much fun. It's when you find these little things that you're like, oh my gosh, no one's going to believe this, but it has to go in.
And that bridge is still standing. And so I was able to see that bridge and take pictures of it and really be able to get a good view of what was happening. I didn't quite go all the way out because I was too scared to do that. So, but I a little bit out because they didn't have it closed off, but there's no railing on the side of it. It's just tracks and boom, you're in the Colorado River. So I wasn't too brave. I felt like maybe I was trespassing, but I did walk up on it a little bit while it was still on the actual side on the bank. So I didn't get too.
Yeah, I probably would have been like you. I would be like, okay, I'm brave. And then I'd be like, yeah, no, not going to do it. And yet you got these kids that are doing it every day. Oh my gosh, that's insane. Yeah. I guess you do what you got to do. And that's one of the things I've learned, especially with writing my historicals, is that, those people who are either amateur historians or actual historians, like working curators at museums, are just such a great resource when you hear about making it as accurate as you can. And so I love that you do that. So Stephanie's saying that Stealing the Preacher was the first book of yours that she read. Now, I think people should start with the book that is just coming out, but it is number 2 in a series. So you probably do want to
is.
start with the one before it, which I don't know where my copy went. Probably my daughter grabbed it. Provides it's Heart's Command, right?
At Love's Command.
At Love's Command, yeah. But a lot of your other books, they're like about sibling groups, or, you know, there's kind of that loose connection. But for the most part, it really doesn't matter which one you start with. So what's your personal favorite? I know it's like asking you to pick a favorite child.
Yeah. That one's a hard question. I think if I was going to pick, I would probably pick To Win Her Heart, which is the one with Levi and Eden. Yeah. He has just a really cool story. He's probably my favorite hero. I'm not supposed to pick favorites, but if I was going to pick a favorite, he's probably my favorite hero.
That's so fun. It's always interesting because, you know, that's one of those questions when I get asked it, so it's not fair to ask. I'm always like, I can't pick, but then there's always one or two where you're like, but this story's really special. And, you know, there's just something about Jet and Savannah or, you know, whatever that makes each story a little unique and different. So do you have go-to snacks while you write?
I try not to snack too much while I write, but I am a big tea drinker. And so usually I'll, especially on a long weekend when I'm trying to make up a lot of lost time and try to get a lot of writing done, I'll sit down with my computer, work for an hour or two, and I'm like, I need a break. So I go and I'll get myself a nice big cup of hot tea. I like it sweetened with honey. And then I come back and it fuels me and I keep working. A couple of years ago, I took a trip with my daughter to Victoria, British Columbia, and we found this historic tea shop downtown that has been there since the turn of the century. And I started buying tea from them. And I came home with a bunch of little sample packs.
Yeah.
And now I order from them full time. And so they're just become my tea supplier. But they have some really fun ones that are, their signature blend was from like 1896. And so that's kind of like my favorite just on principle because it's been around since my time. Yeah. But they have one that they, you know, made for Queen Victoria. They have one called Editor's Blend and one that's a library blend. And so I like
how fun
teas. But so I've kind of become a tea snob with those now.
You know, it is funny how once you get exposed to like really good tea or really good coffee, all of a sudden you do become a snob and you're like, yeah, Starbucks isn't good enough anymore. I need good stuff. That's so fun that you found a shop. And so a lot of people are talking about Short Straw Bride and how that was maybe the first one of yours they read, but how it's also one of their favorites. And I just remember this one being so fun. So how'd you come up with the idea? Do you even remember the idea for this one, or is that a question to ask? 4 brothers, 4 straws, 1 bride. Such a fun premise.
I remember where I got the idea. I don't really remember how I got the idea. My kids were still little back then, and my son was at, I think, baseball practice. And I was just trying to get some exercise while he was at practice. So I was like walking in the neighborhood to the little school where it was. And I remember thinking, you know, what would happen if, you know, I kind of wanted a marriage of convenience story, but I wanted to have something different than just a mail order bride or, you know, that kind of thing. Yeah. And I thought, well, what if they were drawing straws to see who would have to marry her? And how would she feel about that? And what would compel them to do that? And so I don't really remember all the what ifs, but I do remember walking and having that kind of moment.
Yeah.
And
like, this is an idea I should play with for a little while and see what happens. That's so funny. Because Stephanie, Hannah, and Corky are all like, yep, that's my favorite. And I do. I mean, it was years ago that I read it, but I still remember how fun it was and quirky and just, it was different. And so that's really, considering I've already read like 67 books this year, for me to remember is actually pretty good.
That's pretty impressive.
Yeah. So does writing energize or drain you?
It depends on how well the writing is going.
Yes, I was thinking the same thing.
Because there are some days where I work for hours and I feel like I've only written like 2 paragraphs, and that is so draining. And then there's days when it's just flowing and I put it up and I'm like, man, I feel good.
Yeah.
So it just depends.
Well, and I'm working right now on 2 novellas that are coming out in kind of these independent collections later this fall. And the first one, I mean, the semester was just a tough one. So I kept going, oh, I'll write it over the semester, and I just couldn't. And it was like, I felt like I was beating my head against a wall. And then in the last 3 days, the writing's just flowing. And I'm like, oh, this is so much fun. And the dialogue is, I'm like, this is the snarkiest heroine I've written. This is so fun. And then the next one I have to write, I'm like, I don't even have an idea yet. You know, and so like, then I'm going to start that whole process again of beating my head against a wall, and then it'll get fun, and because the words are just flowing, and there's just something fun about that. If I can push through the I'm sitting here and nothing's happening.
Right, exactly.
So what do you do when nothing's happening? Have you gotten any tips or you're like, okay, this is just part of writing now, here's what I need to do? Or do you just not have those moments?
I have a pretty regimented personal schedule. So because I know I write really slow, I can't let myself go very long without having productive writing time. So my goal personally is to write one polished chapter a week. And if I can write one polished chapter a week, then at the end of 40 weeks, I have a full book, which is why I put out one book a year. But because of that, I can be kind of pulling my hair out for a couple days, but I can't let the whole week go. I have to get that chapter done. So sometimes it's just a matter of sitting there and forcing it. Yeah. And once you have something on the page, then you can go back and edit it. And a lot of times with clean eyes after a good night's rest, you go back a day or two later, and all of a sudden you know exactly what to do to fix it and make it flow and all of that.
Yeah, Stephen King talks about, the boys in the basement, letting your subconscious work on it. And for a long time, I'm such a type A personality. And I've had lots of deadlines where they usually are stacks. I'm like, I don't have time, I just got to do it. But I've realized in the last 4 or 5 years that there's a lot of wisdom to, okay, it's not working. That means there's something my brain still needs to kind of chew on, and I'll go for a walk, or I'll let myself watch a movie, or I'll pick up a book like yours that's very different in genre and style from what I write, and just kind of give myself permission to let it kind of percolate for a little while. And then you're right, when you come back to it, or I'll try and stop a chapter or a scene, because I try to write 1,000 or 2,000 words a day when I'm on deadline and it's flowing. And so I'll stop in the middle of a paragraph with a couple bullets of here's what I think is coming next or something. So it's just easier to get back into the flow of it. So, but it's always interesting to see, how different writers, there's no right one process. We're all different, and we just got to figure out what works for us in our style.
Exactly.
So another question we had from your posse was, is there anyone else in your family who writes, or are you the lone typist?
Well, I'm the only one that does it professionally. My mom actually wrote a children's book years and years and years ago. She's never published it. She also wrote a memoir. I lost my dad when I was 16. And so she kind of wrote a book of her process of grieving and finding love again. She remarried a couple years later. And so that was kind of very cathartic for her. So she used writing as kind of a creative outlet and a cathartic kind of process. My daughter, I think because she saw me writing for most of her life, she likes to write as kind of her hobby. So she is a math and computer science double major, and she's now working on her PhD in computer graphics. So she is very left brain kind of person. But she needs a creative outlet. And so she likes to write for fun. She has some groups that she writes with. And I love listening to her talk because she gets so excited about her ideas. And she loves the fantasy genre. And so all these different ideas, and she creates these worlds and that kind of thing. She gets all excited and she writes, a chapter or two, and then you never hear anything else about that one. And then she gets all excited about something else and she writes a little bit, and then, so I think the creating process is more exciting to her than the actual writing process.
Yeah. Well, and that's creating the worlds and just doing something very different from the left brain programming, graphic design, or computer design kind of things.
Yes.
That's so fun. Yeah,
we do have one other published author in the family. I need to make sure I mention him. My husband's father's brother. So
okay.
I guess. Hugh Witemeyer, if you look him up, he is, well, he was an English professor out in Albuquerque, I think. And if you're into Ezra Pound, he has written and edited some books about Ezra Pound. So,
Oh, that's so fun. Yeah, well, and it is interesting how people come to it, and some of us were exposed to it, or we're just like, we love reading, and so we fall in love with words. But it is, there's not really anyone else in my family who writes for publication, although my husband does remind me, he got published in the New York Times, and when they were doing the little journals about what's the pandemic been like for you, and so he sent something in about our new puppy and all the things she chewed up in a day, and got a log line in the New York Times. He's like, I got there first. I'm like, he could probably hit the list if he would write, because he's brilliant. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see if any of my kids follow along. And the other book people are talking about in the comments is Head in the Clouds, which was another really fun one. So if you are new to Karen, I think you're realizing that really you can start with just about any of her books. And if you're not sure about historical, you'll still love hers because they've got these great characters, a wonderful sense of humor. And then there's romance. And in a lot of them, there's another thread as well, like we talked about, whether it's a mystery or a little bit of suspense. But they're just so well done. You're one of the few authors that automatically, when a book comes in, it jumps to the top. I really, kind of the world stops for a day while I read your book. And The Heart's Charge is just fantastic. Congratulations on the release of it.
Thank you.
I'm actually so impressed with this one because you managed to have 2 full romances and neither one felt cheated. And that's not easy to do.
It was tough. And the other thing that was difficult about it was 2 of the characters were characters of color. And being able to write from that perspective was hugely challenging. And I was really nervous about going there, but I wanted to make sure that Jonah and Eliza had as full of a story as Mark and Kate did. And so I had 2 sensitivity readers that came alongside me and read every chapter as I wrote them and gave me wonderful feedback about how to make their voices more authentic, what it was really like in that time period, things that I wouldn't, I think I know, but I don't really know. So having them give that feedback was just hugely helpful.
Well, and I think Toni Shiloh was one of them, and she has a new release today as well. And so I loved seeing that because it is, in today's world, it's challenging, but you don't want to ignore that. I mean, like Eliza's experience is something we need to be aware of. And even the way that Jonah had to act and the deference and things like that, where he just had to really hold back. There's so many parallels to today. So I thought it was a wonderful way, especially since you were being so careful to honor that experience. And I think that that's one of those really important aspects, is how can we honor that? Because we don't want to ignore it. We don't want to pretend like it wasn't real then or now, but doing it well and doing it in a way that actually honors those who that is their experience. And I thought you did that so well. And it was just, like I said, you had 2 really quick romances. One, they'd known each other before, which is what I tend to do when it has to be a short time frame. And then the other, it was just really fun how you made it all work. So believe it or not, we are over our 30 minutes. I'm so glad. And it's just so much fun to read all the comments and things. But thank you so much for joining us today. And congratulations again on the release of The Heart's Command. Is there anything else you'd like for readers to know before we sign off tonight?
I just want to say a big thank you to everybody who reads the book and enjoys it and talks about it. It brightens my day, and it's such an encouragement. A lot of times writing is very solitary, and hearing from readers and their experiences just really makes it all worthwhile.
Absolutely. And y'all are some fans of Karen's. And so one of the best things that you can do is just talk up her books, let people know, write reviews, things like that are such a gift for authors, because that's how people find us, is by word of mouth, saying, hey, have you read Karen? Have you read Cara? Because that's how I often find new authors as well. So thank you so much for joining us today. It was great to have you, Karen, and congratulations again. Thanks to everybody else for joining, and check back next week when Kelly Irvin will be my guest. Okay.
Woohoo!